Director of Konza Prairie, and she will be giving us an overview of the site and the priorities and the activities. So, Dr. Horne.
Thank you. For those of you who have been here to past talks, this is almost the same. So I have added a couple of new slides. So hopefully you won't be too bored. But basically what I'm going to do is talk about sort of the overall picture of Konza and what we've found out in that overall sort of theme over the last 30 or 40 years. And we have somewhere around 150 to 200 active research permits every year with research on all kinds of stuff. They're going to fly, like this year, they're going to fly a drone listening for bird calls over Konza. So we have all sorts of research, soil research, animal research, plants, everything you can think of. So this is a really, really, really skim the top kind of thing of some of the major findings that we have. And you'll learn a lot more about other things as you go through your training. So to start off, and most of you have probably seen this already or something like this, this is the historic, or thought to be the historic range of the Tallgrass Prairie. So it was a pretty big area. And according to the Nature Conservancy some years ago when I stole this map, this was pretty much what was left. And notice there's like this really big splotch right in the middle of Kansas there. And if you calculate it all out, there's about less than 4% of the original range of the tallgrass prairie that remains in North America. And the largest continuous chunk of that is that big splotch in Kansas that's called the Flint Hills, where we live. And Konza is smack in the middle of that Flint Hills. So what is it about the Flint Hills that is still prairie and didn't get plowed under? We have the really rich soil that all the other prairies have, but we have all these rocks. So all these little white spots that you see in here are rocks sitting on the surface of the ground. And you see all these ridges of rocks going around. And when you get up on these uplands, these fairly flat uplands, the soil is very shallow. There are places it's only 5 inches deep. That's not very good for plowing. But it's still rich soil. It's very productive. So it makes really good ranch land. And back in the beginning, before Konza got started, we had researchers here at K-State who knew that there are 3 main factors that sort of interact to maintain a prairie. And you may have heard these already as well. Those 3 main factors are climate. So we have the continental, very variable climate, fire, and grazing. So grazing by large ungulates. So if we use ranching as a replacement for these grazers, and the ranchers burn their property, which they do, we're still able to maintain that original ecosystem of the tallgrass prairie. But Konza and the researchers who were here wanted to find out how those 3 factors that they knew about interacted, how they worked, how all that actually led to maintain a prairie. And so Dr. Lloyd Hulbert started Konza. It started out with just 1,000 acres here, just on the very south part of what is now Konza, and then eventually expanded into 8,600 acres. Headquarters, you should know where that is because you're here. Okay. So headquarters is there. We're bordered on the south by I-70, K-177 on the east, jointly owned by the Nature Conservancy and Kansas State University. The foundation owns that first 1,000 acres on the south, and then the Nature Conservancy owns the rest of it. And then Konza is managed by the Division of Biology at K-State. And so Dr. Hulbert wanted to find out how the prairie worked. So he set up this really big experiment on Konza to find that out. So here's sort of a satellite image of Konza with all the elevations and things, and you can kind of see the borders of the watersheds. And every one of those little borders is a mowed fire guard. So think about the guys who have to go mow that and how much time they spend out there mowing that. And so they split Konza up into these watershed units, And the watershed would be an area where all the water that falls on that area drains down into the creek and runs off. So watershed units, which is why they have those funny borders when they're not just square. And they put burn intervals and grazing treatments. So how often does the prairie need to be burned to have a prairie? How much grazing does it need? What kind of grazing does it need in order to have a prairie? So they set it up. We have all these different watersheds that are burned every year. These are burned every 2 years. These are burned every 3 years, and I'm going to talk more about them a little bit later because these orange ones burned every 3 years are part of a new study that we're doing in the cattle units. 4 years, which originally was thought to be the historic sort of average of how often the prairie burned. So there tend to be a little bit more of the 4 years. Every 20 years, though some of them have gone longer than that. And some of them, this one we've now actually taken out. I need to change the color on it. We're burning it every year now, but it has been a 20-year burn for more than 20 years. And so it's still really brushy. And then down here we have some seasonal ones. So all of our burns are done in spring, around March and April, in that time frame, which is historically when we had the most lightning strikes and that sort of thing. But there are fires that occur at other times of the year. And so we have seasonal burns, a couple of each season down in the south. So those are the summer, which are only burned every other year, because if you burn it 1 year, there's not enough there to burn the next year. So we can only burn them every other year. The fall burns, which we did in November. The winter burns, which we should have done already, but there's all this snow out there. It's kind of hard to burn snow. But hopefully soon it will melt and we get those winter burns in. And then spring burns, which are done pretty much at the same time as all the other springs, but they are the controls for these other seasonal burns. And then on top of that, we have grazing treatments. So this 2,500 acres here, sort of in the middle, except for that one, should be in there, are part of the bison grazing treatment. And then over on the east side, all of these are grazed by cattle. And then all of these that don't have the stripes in them are unburned, or ungrazed areas. Okay. So we started out with this experimental treatment. There have been a few changes to it over the years. It's been modified to do some new studies and that sort of thing, but it's pretty much essentially the same treatment that we started out with 40 years ago. So we have this big experimental treatment, so we can look at grazing and burning that way. But we also are interested in climate. And it's kind of hard to control the climate over at least that big an area. So we have a lot of monitoring stations. You'll drive around, you see these things that look like a big milk can. Those are our rain gauges. We've got a weather station over here that picks up the weather and records it daily. You can sign on to the website and see what the temperature and wind speed and everything is. But one of the characteristics of grasslands pretty much all over the world is the climate is very varied. So just some examples. For today, the record high in 1921 was 73. The record low in 1905 was -12. The average high is 47, the average low is 21. Predicted, when I looked this up, I think Thursday for today, was supposed to be 55 and the low 32. So we're not too far off average for the high. If you look at the highest ever temperature recorded for Manhattan, Kansas, 1936, during the Dust Bowl, was 116 degrees. The record lowest ever temperature was in 1947, -31. Okay, so gets pretty hot, gets pretty cold. And you say, well, you know, this isn't normal. We're off average, whatever. Average doesn't count around here, as far as I can tell, and probably most of you who have lived here forever know this. So this is average temperature per year, plotted here. This is the complete overall average for this entire time period from 1891 to 2013. And then, so all those peaks are individual years, the average temperature for individual years. So you can see we're all over the place, right, in temperature. Same for rainfall. So average annual rainfall, overall, the whole time period, the average is 33 inches, but, you know, all over the place. These are our big floods. This was 93. This was 50, whatever year that was.
51.
51. Right. So a lot of variation in rainfall and temperature. And to sort of emphasize that, this is the Palmer Drought Index. So this takes temperature, rainfall, water use by plants. There's a number of other characteristics. Any of you guys who are in ag probably know more about it than I do. But there's a lot of things that go into calculating the Palmer Index. And if you simplify it, it sort of gives you this long-term estimate of the dryness of the soil. So here's that 1951 flood. This is for the whole state of Kansas, not just for Manhattan. 1951 flood, 41 inches of rain. And the high that year, or the average temperature that year was 52 degrees. The 93 flood, 38 inches of rain. The droughts, the big droughts, 1956, 15 inches of rain. That's like northwestern Kansas, their average. 34, 19 inches of rain. And notice that the big 51 flood, okay, the biggest amount of rainfall, is only a few years away from the lowest amount of rainfall that's ever been recorded in Kansas. So, very variable. And while we can't change the climate over Konza as a whole or on watershed levels, we do change it in small plot areas. So back here behind headquarters, we have all these small plots where we do small-scale experiments. And one of those is the rainfall manipulation plots that has been going on now for 15 years, 10 or 15 years. And what they do is look at the climate predictions for this area, so global climate change. This area is predicted to have about the same amount of average rainfall per year, if you consider average means anything. But it's going to come in bigger storms with longer periods between those rainfalls. And then the temperature is also predicted to go up. So what they've done in these rainfall manipulation plots, they put a roof over the plot. Those big black things in there are big storage tanks. And so when it rains, they collect all the water that rains off those roofs. They store them in those tanks. In the controls, they just put it right back on like it had just rained. Okay? In the ones that are looking at this delayed interval between the rainfalls, they save it and wait until they have several storms saved up, and then they put it all back on at once. So they have these roofs on during the growing season. They take them off in winter, and sometimes they get blown away in storms. It's really great. The guys that have to put those roofs on and keep up with that thing, great time. Anyway, so here's a map looking at, or a graph looking at the percent moisture content in the soil. So soil water content. In plots that have no roof, so those are real control ones. And then plots with natural rainfall, so they have the roof over them, they put the rain back on as soon as it falls. The roofed plots with the delayed rainfall in red. And if you look at this, when they put the roofs on in late March, middle of April, somewhere in there, and you follow it, it takes a while for it to actually start seeing an effect. And then you get these rainfalls, rainfall events, and you start seeing this delay, so the delayed rainfall, and then you'll have increases in moisture content in the areas that are getting natural rainfall and this big gap, right, in the others. So fewer but larger rain events give you longer periods of dry soil. And over the 10 or 15 years they've been doing this experiment, they've found that the plant community in those plots is becoming more like shortgrass prairie, which is in western Kansas, than it is like tallgrass prairie. So even though we're getting the same average amount of rainfall, that delay causes the soil to dry out more and you get a different plant community. You get things shifting to a different plant community. So then what about fire? So Fires were started by lightning. Native Americans, we know, burn to attract bison. And if I were anyone living here, I would burn around my campsite so I don't get a wildfire come through. But currently, most of the burning is done by ranchers to promote grass growth with cattle. And if you've never been out on one of our burns, this is sort of how we do it. This is the K1B or K1A watershed. So we burn now. Historically, these would have been wildfires. They would have gone wherever the wind blew, whatever direction the wind was blowing, at whatever speeds the wind were blowing at, right? And if it was a storm, you'd have 30 or 40 mile an hour winds pushing those fires. We burn at 5 to 15 mile an hour winds. And we start on the side of the watershed away from the wind. So here's the wind blowing across the watershed. We will start over there. And we have all these different fire units. We have 2 that go one way, 2 that go the other way. We're coming to burn school next week. You'll hear all about this. And so we start at one place. The units go one way, lighting fire, and then putting out the fire along the edge. And so this is what's called a backfire. It's burning into the wind. It's very low, very slow burning fire. Right? You can just walk right through it. As you go around the sides, you get some bigger fires. We call them flank fire. Widen out that black protective area. And then you get to the end that has the wind on it. So the wind is actually blowing the fire. Then you get what's called the head fire. These are very hot, very intense fires. If you've been out on a burn, you know you can't stand next to these things. When they show you pictures on TV of people standing next to lava flows and big fires and t-shirts, it's impossible. You can't do it. Right? So huge flames, and this is still only 5 or 15 mile an hour winds. Right? Usually we're burning around 7, 8, 9, 10 mile an hour winds. Think about how big and hot these fires then would be if they were being pushed by a 30 mile an hour wind. And one of these watersheds, sometimes these bigger ones, they'll take us 2 hours to secure the border. And then 10 or 15 minutes, the whole inside is burned once you light that head fire. So very fast. And then here's just finishing up a watershed, and you can see how far the fire has traveled. These are the people lighting right here. You can see how far it's traveled in just, the minutes that they walked that little bit of distance. And then the difference between the size of a backfire and a head fire. So once the fire's gone through, this is what it looks like. And people who are not familiar with this area, oh, it's devastated. It's all gone. It'll never grow back. It's all dead. But, this is the snake eye view of a burned watershed. So down low to the ground. If it's warm enough and there's moisture, within just a few weeks, sometimes a few days, you get this bright green grass sprouting out there. And the whole area turns bright green. And then the snake eye view of that. And notice how much bare earth there sort of is between that grass. It doesn't give you a lot of cover for small animals, like small rodents and snakes and lizards and things. But that soil is much warmer, so the grass can grow a lot faster. And if you're a large animal and you want to eat this grass, this is a lot easier to eat than this is, which is about the same time, but in an unburned area. So you have a lot of the dead material. But again, there's a lot more cover for animals that need cover. So different habitats in those two different kinds of burns. So what do we find when we burn? Okay, so if you increase how often you burn, so increase the frequency of the fire, you increase the dominant warm season grasses, so what we call the C4 grasses. You decrease woody vegetation, the broadleaf plants, the annuals, and cool season grasses. And you decrease, actually, plant diversity. So the more often you burn, the fewer species you have. Because you're favoring only the species that do really well in fire. So decrease plant diversity as you increase the frequency of fire. Adding in grazing, okay, so historically, the prairies had large herds of bison, elk, and pronghorn. In Konza, that big fence out there was originally designed to hold elk and pronghorn and bison. But there's been a lot of trouble introducing pronghorn back to this area, so we don't have pronghorn. And then elk, I think the researchers right now, they want to get a really good handle on what exactly the bison are doing before we add elk. Not to mention that elk are kind of difficult to deal with. Those big animals. How do you get them through a crowd? So we haven't quite worked that out yet. So now for most of the tallgrass prairie, cattle take the place of bison. But here we have a herd of bison that was added in 1987. We got our first herd from Fort Riley when they gave up the herd, that small herd they had. And so we got those, and then every now and then we bring in new blood from other places. We trade animals with people to try to keep the genetic stock up. Our herd, we've done some genetic testing on them. Our herd has very, very few cattle genes in them, if any. So we've got almost pure bison genes out there. We have year-long grazing, so the bison are out there all the time. They were out there during the snow. Do you know if they fed them any during that deep snow? They did give them a little bit. So they can't leave the area. They're stuck in the fenced area. So if we have a really bad storm like this 13 inches of snow, where it's really hard for them to get grass for very long, then we do give them some supplemental hay. But other than that, and that hay is actually taken from our fire guards, so it's still native grass. But that's the only time they actually get supplemental feed. They do get a mineral, because they can't get all the minerals they need in this one small area. So there is a mineral lick for them. But other than that, they're on their own. And we maintain the herd somewhere between 250 and 300 animals to remove about 25% of the productivity of the grass every year, is what the target is. We also don't have a very heavy stocking rate because we don't give them that supplemental feed. So if there's a really bad year like the drought we just had a couple of years ago where they ate everything out there, then they've still got plenty of food. So what does grazing do? Bison and cattle both prefer to eat the dominant grasses that are favored by fire. Okay? So they eat those dominant grasses, and that allows more diversity. So the dominant grasses are knocked down by the bison. You actually get other plants that are able to grow in those areas. So you get a little bit higher plant diversity in areas that are grazed. If you combine the two, burning and grazing, you end up with this mosaic of habitats. So within the grazed areas and also between grazed and ungrazed. So if an area is heavily grazed, there's nothing there to burn, so the fire won't carry through. Right? But bison like burned areas, so they'll go to a different place if it's been burned. And so here you see, trying to get fire going in the grazed area. There's a little person walking over there. And see how patchy that's burning. And here's some really patchy areas on one of the grazing lawns where the bison have really grazed heavily. And then a more even place where they hardly grazed at all, where the fire carried through really well. So you get this real mosaic going on of different kinds of habitats. And the more different kinds of habitats you have, the more plant diversity you have. The more plant diversity you have, the more animal diversity you have. So you end up with an overall area that has a lot more species, right? If you burn in different kinds of patterns. So what do we know about bison versus cattle? Well, they feed on the same grass species. They feed roughly in the same way. If you keep the management of the animals the same, so a long time ago we used to compare bison that grazed year-round to cattle that grazed only during the growing season, or 3 months a year, or however long time they're out there. But we did an experiment for about 10 or 15 years where we equalized all that stuff. Bison were put on in the same numbers as the cattle. They were put on at the same time. They were taken off at the same time. And when you do that, the plant communities are pretty much the same. The cattle graze the same things bison do. They graze them in the same proportion. So as long as they're managed the same, they're very similar as far as the species they eat are concerned. There are a couple things that bison do that cattle don't do. And one of them has an effect on streams. So there's a lot of controversy on trying to keep cattle out of streams. Right? Bison do that naturally. Bison also create intensive grazing lawns. So they spend a lot of time grazing in particular places, and they'll completely ignore some of the slopes unless there's just nothing out there for them to eat otherwise. Cattle tend to graze a little more evenly over the area that they graze in. Bison create wallows. So if you're out on Konza, you see these little depressions. And those are dry most of the time. They take dust from those. But in the spring, when we get our spring rains, they fill up with water. And they make these little miniature wetlands up on these otherwise very dry upland areas. And you get frogs breeding in them. And here's one. Let's see if this works. Did you see the frog in there? It worked a minute ago. How did you do that?
I just clicked in the middle.
Well, I didn't know.
Yep, click now.
Is it from tapping?
Yeah.
Click from tapping?
No, you have to actually click down in the corner.
Down in the corner. Apples. I use a PC. Well, I did that. Yeah. Oh, okay. So you see him now? Yeah. So the chorus frogs, which breed in temporary pools, they really use the wallows a lot. But they often, these things will be packed with eggs sometimes. And then 2 weeks later, the wind will start blowing, it doesn't rain again, and they all dry up. So it's kind of hazardous to do that. And they're only about yay big. So they've got to find these wallows out in the middle of all that prairie and hang out there. So,
Eva,
uh-huh.
what do the frogs do once those pools dry up?
No idea. If you know where they go, I would love for you to tell me, because I have no idea where they go.
They don't bury themselves like some other...
I don't know. Nobody knows. And they're so small, we don't have a really good way to tag them and track them and see where they go. So we have no idea. We don't even know if they come back to the same wallows year after year, or if it's different frogs every year. We know nothing about them because we've got no way to track those little tiny things. And even if we do, you know, if you could mark 100 of them, you'd never see them again. So I don't know where they go or what they do. You know, it's I need some sort of little tracking device that can keep up with one of these, that I can go sit in my office and watch where they go.
A collar? Have you thought about the
A
collar?
collar? Yeah, I need one of those satellite collars for a frog. And we just haven't, you know, the technology hasn't advanced quite enough yet to track those guys and know where they go. They did last year. The last 2 years, the wallows have been dry. There's not been water in any of these temporary pools that these guys are in. But last year, when we had that big rain in July, they went, water, water, you know. And they were all out calling in July, which normally they're the first frogs out, and you only hear them in like February or March. But they were out in July last year because there was water. So they're somewhere out there, and they respond. They're somewhere close enough to the surface. They know when it rains, and they respond to that. But I have no idea where they are. And I actually saw a cricket frog one day, which is another one of the small frogs that's active in summer, hopping across the nature trail, the gravel area of the nature trail. And we were out chasing high temperature lizards, and we had one of those little laser temperature things, and the temperature of that trail was 114 degrees. And this little frog, this big, was hopping across it. So apparently they can withstand a lot more than we think they can. So anyway, little first one. And we had tadpole shrimp in the wallows last year. Are you familiar with tadpole shrimp? You know about fairy shrimp? So these are things, the tadpole shrimp look like miniature trilobites. They're about this big. Or horseshoe crabs. And they live in temporary pools like that when there's water. When there's no water, they'll lay eggs, that are called resting eggs. And those resting eggs can sit there for 50 years until there's water again, then they hatch out. So that was really cool. We don't see those very often, but apparently we have them on Konza and they're in the walls. So you have these little miniature wetlands that bison create that cattle don't. And bison are also kind of tough on woody plants. If you go through the unburned areas in the bison area, you hardly see any cedars. If you go to an unburned area outside the bison area, there are lots of cedar trees. And so bison particularly like cedars. We don't know exactly what they're doing to them. Whether they're not even any young cedar trees, so they must be doing something to them when they're really small. So whether they're eating them or I don't know what they might be doing to them. But they seem to really go after woody plants. And if you've ever tried to put any research in the bison area and you don't put a fence around it, you know that they like to scratch on things. So they scratch on the trees and they rub all the bark off. And cedars especially have thinner bark, so they'll rub all the bark off. So anyway, they're very curious too. They get into everything. And as I mentioned, they're not as constrained by access to water. We've got some research that where they looked at stable isotope ratios in rainwater, stream water, ponds, different places that they could be going to drink. And it turns out they're getting most of their water from what they eat and from these walls. So they're getting most of their water from rainwater and what they eat. They don't spend much time down in the streams. So they don't tear up the stream banks. They don't just stand around down in the ponds when it's hot. If they need a drink, they come in and get a drink and they go back out into the heat. So they're very tough animals. So we put all that stuff together. So these three main factors kind of start with weather patterns because that sort of sets up everything in an ecosystem. And so you have variable weather patterns. They can affect plant growth from year to year and from place to place. We can have 5 inches of rain on one side of Konza and 1 on the other side, or none on the other side. Okay. So you can have really variable rainfall and temperature patterns from place to place and year to year. And weather can also affect where the animals go, not so much on Konza, it's not quite big enough. But historically, it would have affected migration patterns. If it got too cold somewhere a little early, they would go further south. Warmer, and they could have moved further north. Different things like that. It also is very important for fire. So if you have the right low humidity, you have a storm come through, whatever, start a fire, a lot of wind, not so much wind. So from year to year and place to place, you have different conditions from the climate, weather, that affect where the fires go. And then you have interactions between these three things. So where bison graze is going to affect plants, so you'll have really short plants. Where the plants grow is going to affect where the bison graze, so you've got animals moving around and plants being affected by that. Where there's fire, you're going to have different kinds of plant communities. And if you have really high plant growth in one area, then that area may be more likely to burn than another area that has lower plant growth. And the grazers and the fire interact. Bison like burned areas. I'll show you more about that here in a minute. And fire will burn better in places where the bison hasn't been, where it's not been grazed as heavily. So all of these things interact together to create this mosaic of habitats that we call Colorado. One of the recent studies, and when we were talking about collars, this is what we were talking about. So where do the bison spend all their time? This is the bison area, the fence around it, the different burn treatments within there. We have 15 female cows that have been radio collared, and you can see one on that one there. These are collars that give GPS signals for that bison's location that goes to a satellite, and then they come out once a week and download that. And I think it picks up like every 10 minutes or something. Is that what it is? Something like that. So anyway, we know where they're going. And these are matriarchs of their groups, so bison are matriarchal sort of society for the most part. So you have an older cow, her sisters, and her daughters form this kind of core group. The young calves, males up to 2 years old, will hang out with their family. And then once they get about 3 years old, they get kicked out and they become these little bachelor gangs that run around terrorizing everybody. But you have a group, usually, that's with one of those matriarchs. And so where she is, they are. So we can kind of track where the bison are going. And in 2010, these areas were burned in the bison area. Okay. So where were the bison? So where are they spending up most of their time? Where the burns were. Okay. So and this is just during the growing season. They spend most of their time in the burned watersheds. Actually, during the non-growing season, so winter, they spend more time in the unburned watersheds. But during the growing season, they go for those burned watersheds. And I've actually seen them. I swear they stand out there on that burned ground, black ground, waiting for the grass. So that's new research, and they've got data on that now for about 10 years. So they're tracking where the bison go. And they're beginning to look at different usages of the site too, where the wallows are, where the trails are, that sort of thing. Another thing that we're looking at, so I mentioned that the Flint Hills as a whole is still pretty good tall grass prairie because it's been burned and grazed for all these years. But one problem with that we've discovered recently, we're still getting decreases in things like grassland birds, populations of grassland birds. So why is that happening? And one of the hypotheses for this is that areas that are burned every year and heavily grazed, they're very clear. They're all grass, right? And then we have places where people live, around towns and stuff, where it's not burned ever. And those become cedar forest after 40 or 50 years. And so we have the two ends of the continuum, but not as much of the in-between habitats. The less, or the slightly less frequently burned areas. And a lot of the grassland type birds like to nest in those less burned areas, the greater prairie chickens and things like that. So we've got the two ends of the continuum and not as many of the in-betweens. And so one of the research projects we're doing is looking at different management practices. And this was something they started down in Oklahoma. And so this early intensive stocking is what many of the ranchers use. And that's where they burn every year. They stock very heavily. The cattle are only on for 2 or 3 months. And they take them off. They graze very heavily. So that's early intensive stocking. And this patch burning alternative is something like what we've been doing with bison for years and years and years, is you burn one part of the pasture in 1 year, you burn another part the next year, and you let the cattle go where they want, right? So we've set up this eastern side of Konza to do that. So these two red spots, red watersheds, are areas that are being treated as control early intensive stocking sites to compare. This is one of our pastures, and there's 3 watersheds burned on a rotating basis. So these are going to be burned every 3 years. Okay? And in 1 year, this one will burn, the next year this one will burn. And then the same down here. We've got 3 watersheds in this pasture, 1 burned each year. And we're monitoring grassland bird populations and a number of other factors in those watersheds, as well as tracking where the cattle go and how they use the watershed or the pasture. We also have a lot of aquatic research. So you may not think water is that, or creeks are that important, but they really are. And there's a lot of information to be found at them. And this is the watershed for Kings Creek, which is huge. And you notice that it originates pretty much entirely on Konza. So this is a stream that has never had any agricultural inputs into these upper reaches. So this water draining off here can be used, and USGS uses it as a benchmark stream. This is what a stream in tallgrass prairie should look like. And if any of you have heard the announcements out of Illinois that they don't put any more fertilizer on their land that goes into the water than the bison would have historically. Right? Anybody heard that? Yeah, that's one of their arguments, that it doesn't actually, they're not actually affecting the dead zone in the Gulf because they don't put any more fertilizer on than the bison would have historically. There are bison in here. There is almost no nitrogen in this stream compared to what you see when you get down to McDowell Creek that runs through the area. So something to think about there. We also have this watershed, Shane Creek, that is in that new Patchburn Graze area. So we're monitoring this creek to see the effects of patchburn grazing and how that may move the cattle around and how that might affect the stream watershed. So we can compare that to the bison-used watersheds as well as just what's going on with the cattle. And then the last thing, as many of you may know or some of you don't, we are a site for the Long-Term Ecological Research, LTER site. So this is a organization or group of research sites that have been funded by NSF for years and years and years now. Konza was one of the initial 6 sites. It's been a site for the whole time. We hope to continue to be a site, or we're up for funding again this year, right? So keep your fingers crossed. That grant proposal goes in soon. But we have databases for 70 or more, I don't know what they're actually up to now, different kinds of data that are collected out here that have been collected since we started back in 1981. And so lots and lots of research going on out here with that. We are also going to be a site for NEON. Are you familiar with NEON? It's the National Ecological Observatory Network. So they're setting up a lot of different areas across the country, similar to this. They're going to collect exactly the same data in exactly the same way. So LTER, they're collecting sort of similar data, but it's up to the researchers in a particular site to concentrate on what is important for that particular habitat or ecosystem. NEON is getting exactly the same data, exactly the same way over all these different sites. And we're going to have a tower for that up on K2A, so you'll be passing it if you go hiking the nature trail. And that's going to be collecting a lot of different information. We'll be part of that national network as well. And with that, I have a pretty slide showing 9 open questions. Yes, cattle are attracted to bird areas. They will spend more time in bird areas. We've only been doing the patchburn grazing study for 2 years now, I think. So we don't have a lot of data on that. But we are monitoring that, and cattle will spend more time on bird areas.
At one time they were doing some tagging of deer. Is there any tracking of how deer affects life?
The deer were tagged by the Wildlife Society students, and they were basically monitoring population size. We've not actually tracked them around. I don't know that anybody's ever really done a study to see exactly where the deer go and what they do with everything.
Is it long enough that you can see the ebb and flow of population?
I don't know how, I don't remember. I haven't seen those data in a long time, and I don't remember what they found. I don't know if they're still doing it or not.
Eva?
Yes?
My understanding is anytime you see a deer with a tag, if you can see the number on it or the color, you're to report it. And when I do that, I do it to Drew.
Yeah.
I send him the information.
Yeah, Drew Ricketts, one of the grad students, or Jill's husband.
Yeah.
He's in charge of the Wildlife Society students. So they may still, do you know if they're still catching and tagging deer?
I don't think so.
Yeah, I don't think they've done it in a couple of years. But it was something that the Wildlife Society students wanted to do to get more experience doing that sort of thing too. So it was mostly more of a little more of an educational type thing than it was a serious study, but they got some good data out of it anyway. Yeah.
A few years ago, there was a move afoot to thin the deer herd. Has anything more been done about that?
We bring it up and talk about it every now and then. We've not come up with a good strategy for doing that. You know, if we open it up to hunting, you know, we've got a problem with that. We talked about having very limited kinds of hunt, maybe for handicapped or kids or something like that, and having most of the site shut down while we have these hunts. But we talked about the numbers that would be taken from one of those hunts, and it really wouldn't affect the population. So we need a lot, if we're going to make an impact on the population, we need something more than just like one day of hunting. So it's still something we bring up and debate and talk about every now and then, but we've never figured out a really good strategy for doing it. Any other questions?
What about the discussion on 20-year burners? I know that is very hot topic.
That's another ongoing discussion, and we have people who want to keep the 20-year burns. We have people who want to take away the 20-year burns. And again, it's still one of those kind of up in the air things. We have taken some of them out of cycle. We've taken at least a couple of the 4-year burns out. They're now annuals. We took the 10 years completely out. They don't exist anymore. And we've taken one of that K20A along the nature trail is now an annual burn instead of a 20-year. So we are doing a few here and there, but again, that's still another debate that is ongoing.
You might mention the fire reversal plots too.
Yes, we do have the fire reversal plots where we took what was a 20-year watershed and made it an annual, and an annual and made it a 20. And that's how we know that once you get all that brushy, woody growth out there, you don't get rid of it by burning it every year. Those have been reversed now for probably over 10 years, and we still have brushy.
2001.
Yeah, we still have some brush in those areas that had been 20-year burns. So it takes a long time. You can kill cedars with several years of burning annually, but not that dogwood brushy stuff that's there. It takes forever to get rid of that.
Sure.
You know, if you want to run questions?